This episode is brought to you by Strategies for Supporting Twice Exceptional Students. The course from Emily Kircher-Morris is a learning and continuing education opportunity for school districts everywhere. Go to neurodiversity.university or click the link in the show notes.
One individual whose nervous system is feeling more regulated loans their regulation, offers some regulation to somebody who's feeling less regulated with an invitation to come join me here in this more regulated space.
As parents and educators, we've all had moments where a child's behavior leaves us baffled. We search for answers, try different approaches, and sometimes wonder if we're doing something wrong. But what if these moments are actually doorways to deeper understanding? Author and expert Robyn Gobbel joins us to share practical brain-body sensory strategies that really work. That's straight ahead on episode 254. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity?
You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
Have any of you ever run a marathon? I have not, and let's be honest, I never will. But I do feel like writing a book is a bit of a similar experience. The finish line is finally in sight, and neurodiversity affirming schools, transforming practices so all students feel accepted and supported, will be in the world within a week. I'm excited, and I'm exhausted, and I'm proud, and I'm overwhelmed, and I feel like these last few days will drag, but they'll also be here before I know it. Amanda Morin's my co-author, and we've both written books in the past and talked about how this one is the hardest we've ever written because it's really asking people to think differently about how we understand neurodiversity and how it's supported in educational settings. We cannot wait for people to have this book in their hands. Since Amanda lives in Maine and I live in Missouri, we aren't hosting a typical book launch party, but we are going to have a virtual book launch, and you're all invited. On Friday, January 24th, you can hop on a Zoom with us to celebrate the book finally being in the world. We'll have games and general frivolity. Anyway, if you want to hop on the Zoom and join us, you can grab the link in the show notes and help us launch this book into the world. All right, Robyn Gobbel is here with me next.
Previously on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Maybe your kid's not going to sign up for the baseball team or go to birthday parties because those are wildly overwhelming and out of their comfort zone. Maybe the kinesthetic stuff is really tough. Dropping a neurodivergent kid off at a birthday party who needs something really concrete, that is the antithesis of that. But being in a virtual Dungeons & Dragons program where I have a role, I know who I am, I can be an avatar, someone that has traits that I aspire to be, that is really attractive. And that might build more confidence. It might help me find people. And maybe anecdotally we're sharing stories and I find something that the real human me, not my avatar, has a connection with that person, and then we kind of hit it off that way. A big part of us has to just let go, ask ourselves why. We have to ask, what are we hoping for? And let go of the how.
That's episode 250. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
Today, I'm talking to Robyn Gobbel. Robyn has a master's degree in social work and specializes in relational neuroscience, trauma-informed care, and child development. She does a ton of work with educators and parents, and she's the author of Raising Kids with Big Baffling Behaviors, Brain-Body Sensory Strategies That Really Work. She's also the host of the podcast, The Baffling Behaviors Show. So, Robyn, thank you so much for talking to me today.
Oh, thank you for having me. This is just going to be a blast.
I have to start off and say, I actually really like your use of the word baffling in the title of your book and the name of your podcast, because first of all, it's just a fun word to say.
Yes.
And also because I think it is such a good description of how we sometimes are at a loss when we're trying to interpret what our kids are telling us with their behavior. I think it's a better term than say, confusing or problematic or concerning, because those all just carry that judgment, those negative connotations, while baffling is more of this invitation to dig deeper and really think about what's going on with the young people in our lives. So what does the concept of baffling behavior mean to you, and what can it look like?
Baffling for me is the way that the parents who are coming into my office were feeling, right? They had this sense of, this doesn't make any sense, right? What is happening in front of me compared with what I have been taught about kids and behaviors, and also how I'm supposed to help my kids and their behaviors. They are absolutely not matching. And I agree with you that, I use the word baffling very intentionally, of course, and that it feels more open. And it's, I think, not pejorative. And that was one of my big criteria, even when titling the book, was I did not want there to be pejorative language on a book that was going to be laying around people's houses. And then parents also tell me that they feel like the word can really describe how they end up looking at their own behaviors, that they are so surprised and baffled by how they're responding to their kids.
These are just the things I think about just always with wording and how we phrase things, and the importance of neurodiversity affirming language and how important that is in how we convey our thoughts to our kids or to other people, but also in how we feel about them.
Yes.
And how we interpret those. And I feel like the thing about baffling is it's more about the person who's feeling it as opposed to the person who's causing it.
Yeah.
I thought that was just a good term to kind of invite people into the conversation and make them feel like, okay, this is something we can figure out. This is something we can solve. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that really can cause young people to have a difficult time managing emotions, having some of those behaviors. And specifically, I want to focus on thinking about how some kids, especially neurodivergent kids and teens, really have those really sensitive and vulnerable nervous systems. Tell us a little bit about that.
When I think about baffling behaviors, I usually think about these two tracks, for lack of better words. And I'll start with the one that kind of brought me into this work, which is the types of behaviors that emerge from a nervous system that's been really, really hurt relationally. So the vast majority of my clinical experience and what I did when I was actively practicing in the therapy room was work with kids who had experienced profound abuse and neglect. Many of them had been removed from their original families and were being raised in new families, adoptive families, kinship care families, something like that. And there is something pretty devastating that happens in the nervous system when the developing brain is experiencing terror from the very place that it is supposed to be feeling safety. And how that impacts the nervous system in my clinical experience is kind of the key piece in this baffling piece. That so often it would come back down to how their nervous system had stored those traumatic experiences and then how that was impacting their behaviors. But the other big piece, and the piece that I think has made my work more and more accessible to people beyond folks caring for kids who have had severe attachment trauma, is the sensitivity in the nervous system, the vulnerability in the nervous system, and the stress response system, in which the stress response system is having an objectively huge response in comparison to the stressor, right? Where the stressor and the stress response, kind of when you're looking at it from the outside in, you're like, whoa, that doesn't match. And so often it doesn't match so intensely that folks don't even recognize that there was a trigger or was a stressor. Right. And so I'm sure you hear this too. Like there wasn't even anything that happened, or this doesn't even make any sense. Or, my kid chucked the remote control at the television screen because it was time to come off screen time. And all I did was say, it's time to start getting ready for bed. And so reminding parents that even though it feels like that shouldn't be a stressor, not being able to do what you want to do is a stressor. Like for every human on the planet, for everyone, none of us like to not do what we want to do.
That is true.
But we develop some resilience in our stress response system.
Yeah.
But when the stress response feels so mismatched to the stressor, to the point where parents are like, I didn't even see that there was a stressor. That behavior, parents are so baffled. And then we label it all sorts of different ways, right? Characterological. Oftentimes they're spoiled, they're manipulative, they're, because we're baffled. And when our brain is baffled, we go, to quick, easy answers.
Yeah. And just kind of tying that in with the neurodivergent piece. So first of all, in my new book that's going to come out, we talk a lot about trauma-informed practices in the schools and neurodiversity-affirming practices in the schools and how they are so closely aligned because there's so many similarities. And you're talking about kids who maybe aren't neurodivergent just based on their neurotype that they were born with, but they have this trauma that has caused some of these other pieces.
Exactly.
And, I think also it's really important to recognize that for neurodivergent kids or adults, but especially kids in schools or even at home, because they have that different sensory integration so often, their nervous system is more vulnerable, in addition to the fact that they are constantly under this pressure or stress of being uncomfortable or just overwhelmed by their sensory experience.
Yes. And then unseen.
Yes.
To have this vulnerability in a world that is, where we're typically expecting people to live right in the middle of the bell-shaped curve and be really similar to each other, what that ends up being is so unseen. And I would call that, moving into the kind of attachment toxic stress realm of things. So often they do really overlap.
Yeah. And when you talk about the triggers that people don't even notice, they don't even see, like that's such a common pattern that I see in not realizing sometimes kids just don't have the language to really describe what it is they're experiencing. So then we are caught in this pattern of trying to interpret what those behaviors are.
100%. I mean, adults, really, truly, like just last night or the night before, my husband and I were like fussing at each other, and then he had to go to a meeting. So there was this like natural endpoint in our fussing at each other. And as he was gone, I was able to kind of think a little further through about like what was really bothering me. And it wasn't what I was fussing at him about, honestly, at all. And I'm like a pretty emotionally competent, grown up with, frankly, a very, I have a lot of resilience and a lot of supports in my life. And even I needed some time to think about like that thing that I thought was the trigger, that really wasn't the trigger at all. Here's the thing that's actually stressing me out.
Well, and I think that leads into the next thing that I wanted to ask you about, which is co-regulation. I love that idea of co-regulation and kind of using it as a strategy or a tool that really kind of precedes the expectation that kids are able to self-regulate, that we need to do this along with them. So what is co-regulation? And how is it something that anyone who's working with young people, whether they're at home or at school or somewhere else, can implement as a tool to help with those behaviors?
I think probably the simplest way, there's a lot of ways we could describe, define co-regulation. I think the simplest way to describe it would be that one individual whose nervous system is feeling more regulated, kind of loans their regulation, offers some regulation to somebody who's feeling less regulated with an invitation to come join me here in this more regulated space. Humans are creatures who need to be co-regulated. That even, again, I've at this stage of my life have a relatively resilient stress response system. I still need oodles and oodles of co-regulation. Some of it I don't even notice. It's just like infused in my life. But when I'm upset, when I'm stressed out, I turn to my people for help or for support. So co-regulation is a human experience that we need, from before we're born until, our last breaths. If we look at it and compare and contrast it to this idea of self-regulation, where I can kind of use my own resources to maintain or return to a more regulated place. The way that they are related to one another is that self-regulation is, in most ways, a byproduct of having experienced a lot of co-regulation. It's in a way a developmental milestone that is, quote unquote, achieved through experiences of having a significant amount of co-regulation by a regulated person. So when we think about using it as a tool, the first thing we have to do is shift our lens on what the behavior is and what it needs in order to change, right? And if we think about behavior as something that someone is making a choice to do because of their, poor morals and values, then thinking about co-regulation doesn't actually make a lot of sense. But if we go from the underlying assumption that Ross Greene says kids do well when they can, if we look at the neuroscience, folks who are regulated and feeling connected to themselves and others and experiencing felt safety, they behave in ways we're not typically trying to change. When they have what they need, including regulation, they're not behaving in ways that we're trying to change. So if someone is struggling, they need some support. They need some help. They almost certainly need some help in their circuits inside their own nervous system. And so thinking about it from a lens of what does this child need in this moment? How do I move in and offer them the support that they need, which could be practical. I think about scaffolding. Scaffolding is absolutely a form of co-regulation. Or it could be, oftentimes when people say co-regulation, they think about soothing, right? Emotional support, that idea with co-regulation, knowing that once the individual's nervous system is sort of back in a more regulated state, then what will happen next generally aren't behaviors that we're trying to change.
So you talk about kind of the soothing. It might be some of the practical strategies, kind of the scaffolding of the skills, whatever it is that they're struggling with. What might it look like in other situations?
I think we have to think about what is this child, based on what we know about this kid, and using as much kind of our own, what I would call owl brain as possible. Like, what does this child need in order to be okay? I mean, some kids need some additional sensory supports to come in. They need a different environment. They need things to be louder. They need things to be quieter. Some kids need their physical bodies tended to, right? And they need obvious things like they need to have a snack. They need a drink. And then we can also think about those even through the lens of what types of sensory supports would support this person. So we're going to think about co-regulation from the sense of like, I'm a more regulated person. I can kind of use my thinking brain here to think, what would be supportive of this person's nervous system feeling better again, feeling safe again, feeling regulated again? What do I know about this person? And what kinds of things could I offer them that would help them feel safe enough to return to this more regulated state?
Hey there, educators. Since you're listening to this podcast, we know you're passionate about unlocking the potential of every student. That's why we started the Neurodiversity University and developed our course, Strategies for Supporting Twice Exceptional Students. This isn't just another online course. It was created by the host of this podcast, Emily Kircher-Morris, who's a former educator and now a mental health counselor and trainer who works with school districts, organizations, and companies to help them understand and serve people with learning differences. Imagine having practical strategies at your fingertips to support students with ADHD, autism, dyslexia, and more. This course gives you the tools to help students of all neurotypes thrive. It's available for in-house professional development, site licenses for districts, and independent study for teachers and parents. Ready to make a real difference? Go to neurodiversity.university or call us at 929-445-8255. Look for a link in the show notes.
Let's dig into this the brain-body sensory approach a little bit more deeply. I mean, I feel like we're touching on it with some of these others, but can you walk us through the interplay between that brain-body sensory approach and how you think about that?
So often when we are thinking about strategies, we are thinking about what I would call kind of brain-based owl brain strategies. We're thinking about using logic. We're thinking about using reasoning. We're thinking about helping kids lean into their coping skills, right? And there's a time and a place for those things, for sure. And looking at the origins of behaviors and where they actually start in that neural impulse in the brain and in the nervous system, and how it is taking in information from the sensory world, processing that information, and then making decisions about what am I going to do next. And we can, I think, lean into that by intentionally shifting the sensory experience, shifting their body experience. And we can do that in all sorts of ways. And we can really get really curious about what that person is doing and look for cues. Oftentimes people are telling us what they need. If we could just look at it through a slightly different lens. And so much of what I'm hoping folks will do, especially when thinking about body and sensory, is really even just a mindset shift. Right. So instead of relying on these logical approaches to changing behavior, can we look at what's happening in their body, what's happening in their sensory environment, make adjustments to that so that we can support what their body needs to feel okay?
Yeah, I think that that's such an important component as we really try to connect with young people and get to that regulated place, because they don't like to feel dysregulated. I mean, that's sometimes I think how people interpret it, like, oh, well, they're being defiant.
Yeah.
Usually it's because there's something else going on and they can't get to a place where it's balanced, where they're feeling steady or stable with all of it. And so then that's how it comes out.
Right. Well, all behavior is an attempt at finding regulation.
Yeah.
There's just no real reason for the human to do anything else. Sometimes they don't work very well, right? And there's a whole lot of other, reasons that go into why we continue to do things that don't necessarily work out great for us. I mean, we all do that. But if we look at it just from that lens, like even defiance, like something about this is that person's attempt at finding safety again.
Yeah. I work a lot with educators, and one of the things that we often take time to reflect on and understand is how some of our students' behavior can often trigger a reaction in us.
Yeah.
So for me, when I was in the classroom, when a student would come up to me and say, I don't get it, that would cause my frustration level to rise, because even though I was always there to help them, that vague, I don't get it statement didn't help me help them.
Yeah.
And I know I have these things as a parent too that will elicit this kind of knee-jerk response. And it takes time to be aware of those and regulate my own emotions before I respond. So what insights do you have about the importance of adults navigating their own emotional states when they are also then trying to support the young people in their lives?
The first thing I would do is take something that you said and shift it just a tiny bit, which is not that we have some triggers or some ways that we're reacting to other people's behaviors.
Yeah.
Everything is a reaction.
Right.
And sometimes the reaction is one that works for the interaction and it keeps the serve and return going and it maintains the safety and connection in the relationship. And sometimes it doesn't, but we are always reacting to what people are doing. And we are always reacting. In fact, most of what we're doing is a reaction out of our own history. And so I think when we notice that like depersonalizes it and deshames it. There isn't this sense of like, I'm getting triggered, which I think can carry this weight of like, there's something wrong with me for getting triggered, or I'm not doing my job well enough, or I'm not mature enough, whatever. There's all sorts of like connotations that go along with that. It's not exactly about that. It's about the fact that we're all always reacting to one another. There's no way not to. There's also no way not to have most of your reaction have nothing to do with what's even happening. That is just simply how the brain works. Very little of how we're reacting is in response to what's happening right in front of us. There's nothing wrong with that. That is literally how the human brain is supposed to work. Like, we couldn't even begin to wrap our brains around how clunky life would be if we didn't do that.
Well, it's like a shortcut. It's like you use these shortcuts based on past experiences, and that's what kind of drives it.
100%. And it might sound like I'm getting a little bit too in the weeds here, but I really have found this is a really crucial part for adults to bring some compassion and just like return their humanity back to themselves. Like simply because you're a teacher, because you're a therapist, or because you're a parent doesn't mean you have like checked your humanity at the door and now you're supposed to appear as this perfectly regulated, person who can handle everything. That's not true at all. We all are going to have things that hit us or land on us in a way that's helpful or not helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Right? It's like you said, if a kid comes to you and says, well, I think, what'd you say? Like, I don't get it. Like it was just
yes, feel hopeless.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I have something similar when somebody reaches out to me and essentially asks me for something I haven't yet given them. And I'm a very giving individual. I give away a lot of material. I will help almost anyone. But if someone has to ask me for it, I am initially a little bit outraged by it. And I can get a little indignant. Like, come on, people.
Mm-hmm.
Like, can I never make you happy? Right? Like, all this happens in my head. And if I pause and think about it for a second, what it really is like I learned somewhere in my life a very, very long time ago that if I didn't anticipate everybody's needs and meet them before they asked for them, my entire life was going to implode.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it did.
Mm-hmm.
I can notice that perhaps my own reaction is bigger than needed, meaning it's not actually helping me solve the problem.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Right? Like a kid comes to you and says, I don't get it. Like, well, you are the teacher. You're going to have to try to help solve this problem somehow.
Yes.
Right? And so, so noticing all of those pieces and just noticing that this is a very, very, very human experience. You're not doing anything wrong. You're not a bad teacher. I'm not a bad whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And also being curious about these things doesn't make it your fault.
Right.
And we have to disentangle that part too. Sometimes when we're asking adults to track their own reactions, what they hear is, you're blaming me for this.
What I hear you also saying, though, is like the neutrality and the openness that we need to approach the behaviors of the kids who we're working with. We also need to offer that to ourselves.
100%.
As we investigate, why am I having this reaction?
Yeah.
When you were describing that experience of your, of your kind of knee-jerk reaction when you get those emails, like there's so many times in my life that I have that. And if I'm able to take the step back, if I don't get so upset about it, for whatever reason, I can go, okay, this is not that big a deal. But it's harder sometimes than others. And I recognize that. And I am far from a perfect parent. I'm a clinician, I'm a teacher, all these different things. Unfortunately, I think our own kids get the worst of it sometimes.
I do this work because that's how badly I need to be immersed in this work.
Yeah.
So whenever anybody thinks I've got it all figured out, I'm like, oh no, I've got it so not figured out that I've literally made this my job.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think also there's something about just modeling that for kids too, like recognizing we don't always have all of our own emotions in check.
For sure.
And just verbalizing that, talking about it, saying what it is, can be really powerful for kids to go, oh, wait, I don't have to know exactly how to do this every single time. I can mess up and that's okay.
Yeah.
I love talking about all of this and I want to kind of rapid fire. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Practical steps. Like what are some of the things that you feel like are the highest leverage tools that parents, educators, anybody might be able to use, get a lot of distance without maybe as much effort?
Yeah. The lowest hanging fruit. So when we look at the science behind the concept of felt safety, which is what's underneath the state of our nervous system, we see that felt safety is cues that we're taking from what's happening inside our body, from what's happening in the environment, what's happening in the relationship. So if I'm going to go to lowest hanging fruit, I tend to go there because I can kind of categorize it. So we've got a kid who's struggling. Let's think about, first of all, let's think about things that we just have to guess about because we can't see inside a child's body, but let's pretend we can, put our x-ray vision goggles on and think about when was the last time this child ate anything, drank anything, went to the bathroom, moved their body. Even though it seems like those are so obvious, like, of course we're thinking about if kids are hungry or not. No, but we're not. And I'm a parent too, so this is no judgment. But if we pause and go, when did they last eat? When did they last drink? When did they last move? Do they need to go to the bathroom? And then we can go a step beyond that too, I think, is like, are they just not feeling well? I have learned a lot from my own personal experience about neuroimmune disorders and what is happening inside the body that can just leave it so stuck in what I would call protection mode. And I think this is where we're going next in the science and in the clinical application of the science, is really realizing like we're not in charge of our behaviors at all. Like it is coming from how we feel on the inside. And usually that means how bad we feel on the inside, because we don't spend a lot of time talking about good behavior. We just spend time talking about bad behavior. So it's like, what is going on? And we can't always address that in the moment. But when I have kids who are chronically struggling and you look at their worlds and everything else is like basically okay enough, that's when I'm like, okay, so we've got to start investigating even further about what's happening in their immune system, what's happening in all these other places. But food, drink, movement, sunlight. So that's the inside world. And then the outside world is their environment. I'm thinking structure, routine, predictability. The brain really is obsessed with knowing what's about to happen next, to the point where it sort of makes it happen. Right? Like when kids don't know what's about to happen next, they stay in a more tenuous kind of protection mode place. And in many circumstances, especially if they have histories that have toxic stress in them, they're going to kind of manipulate what's about to happen, what's going to happen next. And it's oftentimes not going to be great, because they would much rather be in charge and predict it and have it happen than kind of sit in this ambiguous place. So I really help families look at, again, structure, routine, predictability. Most of the time, we need to increase those things. Sometimes I have families where the stress overload, the burnout is so substantial that we really need to look at, okay, so are there ways we actually need to significantly decrease structure, routine, the ways that it's maybe causing stress as opposed to alleviating stress. I know in my personal life, there's a lot of leaks in how we run as a structured unit. And I can almost always help a family kind of just dial in a little bit structure, routine, predictability in a way that doesn't cause rigidity.
Yeah.
Because then we start to flip back the other direction. And then the third category is that between category, like what's happening relationally. So I'm looking at that in two ways. One, sometimes we just have to be honest with ourselves. How connected am I with my kid right now? Like in this season of life, and what's happening with the stressors in my life, with what's, there's all sorts of things that are happening that can be impacting how connected I am with my kid. But then also, what is the state? That's the what is the state of my own nervous system piece. And sometimes we have to start there, because we can't do much of anything else.
Right.
Until we start with what's happening for you, mom, dad, teacher, grandma, grandpa, whoever the caregiver is.
Robyn, this has been such a great conversation. But this brings me to my last question. So if you were talking to a parent who was truly feeling baffled by the behavior that they are seeing in their child, and then also feeling like they are failing as a parent because they just don't know what to do, what would you say to them? What is it that you would really want them to hear?
All behavior makes sense, even theirs. And it might feel like we're holding these two opposites next to each other, and maybe in a way we are. The behavior is without question baffling, and something about it makes perfect sense. And we might be able to figure it out, but we might not. But even if we can't figure it out, if we really can believe something about this does make sense, including my own behavior that maybe has even hurt someone that I'm like so ashamed of and so embarrassed by, something about it makes sense. What almost always happens next is a breath. There's a little spaciousness that opens up. It's a moment where our nervous system can kind of rest and shift. And maybe it doesn't get to stay there, but even a moment of it is really good for us. And if it does stay there, then we can start to do our detective work, right? Like, what is happening in this moment? And if we think about the pieces that make up behavior, we might start to get some ideas that might help bring a child back into more regulation and connection and felt safety. But we have to start with all of this makes sense, including how bad you feel.
Totally. Robyn Gobbel, author of Raising Kids with Big Baffling Behaviors and host of the Baffling Behavior podcast. Thanks so much for talking to me today.
Thanks, Emily.
Have you ever caught yourself reacting to something someone does and then thought, wow, where did that come from? It's worth hitting pause and thinking about the chain of events. What's behind that reaction? Maybe you're hungry or tired, or you've got something else weighing on your mind that's shrinking your window of tolerance. Maybe there's something deeper, something from your past that has shaped how you see or feel about a situation. And here's a big one. How did people react to you in a similar situation? Are you mirroring that reaction now, or are you doing something different? And why? This kind of self-reflection helps us shift from reacting to responding. The difference is subtle, but it's powerful. Reacting is automatic. Responding takes intention. And when we take the time to be intentional, we're not just understanding the people around us better, we're growing too. So let's keep working on that awareness. It's a small shift, but it makes a big difference for others and for ourselves. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity podcast.
This episode has been brought to you by the online course, Strategies for Supporting Twice Exceptional Students. You can click the link in the show notes to learn more and get it for your school, or take it yourself as an individual. It's all up to you. Thanks to Robyn Gobbel. We have links to her books and pertinent info in the show notes as well. Also, you may be sizing up your wardrobe for the spring or fall if you're in the Southern Hemisphere. I don't want to leave you guys out, sorry. Anyway, our merch page is a great place to start. It's at neurodiversitypodcast.com, and our website has all 254 episodes now and anything you want to know regarding our podcast, so check it out. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Our executive assistant is Corey Orrick. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us, thank you for listening. We'll see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.